So to start off, what I'd like us to do is a bit of an exercise. Not super easy over webinar, I appreciate, but let's give it a go. So what I'd like you to do is read the 6 statements and just make a note of which ones you think are most believable, which ones you think are not believable. So here's the 6 statements. So you can, if you've pen and bit of paper to hand, just write down the number of which number statements you think are believable and which number you think aren't believable. Sense? Minutes to do that. These webinars are put online, so it's a really way to start an online record webinar, isn't it? Just like a minute's dead air. Crowd pleasers. Okay, you've just joined. If you can make note of which of these 6 statements you leave, basically, and which you think and won't. Then we'll go later. But keep those to hand because we're going to return to those in a bit. All right. So, as I said, we basically did this frames inquiry with 5 different student unions. So the first question is, what on earth is a frames inquiry, and why should we care about student unions, right? So, we're always trying to shape in student unions, whether we tend to or not. We're actually always trying to shape students' behaviours. So we want them to lock up for Easter, and we want them to drop in and grow carrots, and we want them to vote. We really want them to vote. We want them to keep warm with a chunky zip hood, right? Want to shape attitudes, right? So we believe quite strongly in equality and liberation stuff. We want the students to help us redundancies at institutions. We want people to run their campus. Recently, there's been a huge groundswell around investment. So, as well as shaping students' behaviours, we're also trying to shape their attitudes, right? And communications, like refers to communications as commands. We're basically, we need to be pretty clear that all communications are commands, and within these communications, referred to as frames. Okay. So what are frames? So frames are basically mental schemas or structures that shape how we understand the world. So they create the kind of meaning that's uploaded in our brains when we're exposed to certain situations or words. So these shapes our attitudes and behaviours, right? So if I say school to you now, then a whole terms and phrases and relationships will come when I say school to you. So that's basically what we mean. Basically, it's meaning that's uploaded into your brains when you're at certain words or issues. So frames are quite interesting things. So it can mean that this little guy is like, yeah, success, or it can be like, I'm gonna fuck you up, or be like, oh, crunchy. And are left in frames and things are left out of frames. So we're going to try and do this via webinar. Can you just type in the little chat box affects the economy? You, Amy? Yeah. In general, what else affects the economy? Yeah. Yeah. All this is Amy. Yeah, absolutely. So business behaviour, wars, that could be all the social phenomenon. But yeah, other things that affect the economy. Okay. Yeah. See, a whole bunch of different stuff, isn't there, that affect. So people mentioned MPs, like employment, but these other things as well: consumer confidence, house price, infrastructure, exchange rate, interest rates, technological development. But so all these different variables within the economy, with the current debates, it tends to be focused still on a couple of things. Right? It tends to be all focuses on immigrant spending, and that's another example of frame of what is. It's about frame the economy means to people, right? And so that means that that banking didn't cause a financial crisis, that somehow overspending did, that and so the ingredients basically that we look for in frame. So most will use kind of very vivid images, right? So if you think of migration, this idea of the flood of immigration, that's a very sort of vivid. Using a lot of metaphors. Obviously, you can't really have an actual flood of immigration. There tends to be characters in these things. So the heroes and villains, right? And then there's a moral to the tale in most frames. So this is an example in the economy, is that there's this idea of strivers, these hardworking people, and the skivers who sort of don't open their curtains. Yeah. And the best frame to be simple and easy to be told. So this written being broke is using it basically compares the national economy to like your own wallet, as if out on a Friday night getting drunk and spending 50 quid is the same as what basically, and then coming home and being like, oh no, I've got money left, I've got drunk and spent money, is basically the same as how national economy works. But nevertheless, because it's quite simple, the idea of it being just broke in the same way that you might be broke if you spent all your money, it's easy to be retold. And the sort of framing engages one understanding over another, like the example that there is no alternative to austerity. Right? So in simple terms, like, over time, and this is George Lakoff, who's one of the leading cognitive linguists on frames. Over time, what we found is that repeated frames, so years, it means that they become embedded, so they will affect how we think the world is, how we think it will be, and it will reject the idea of information that sits outside of the frame. So, turn to the example of immigration, for example, you may, like I have, had conversations with people where you try and provide facts and figures about why immigration, is such a huge problem for the economy and actually is a net contributor. People will reject those stats and be like, oh no, either negate whether the facts are true, or just regardless of that, still continue with their perspective. And so that example, in terms of Lakoff's understanding of how this stuff works, of how frames are operating. So to recap, basically, effective frames will tell a story using vivid images and metaphors, tends to be these heroes and villains and morals to the tale, and they have to be simple and retellable, and then the effect of those is to shape people's views of the world by emphasising one understanding over another, that then in turn shapes our attitudes and behaviours. So, for example, a test that the psychologist Lieberman ran, and basically, even in a scenario where just the game was different, so they two groups of participants to exactly the same game, but one game was called the Wall Street game and one game was called the community game. The people who played the Wall Street game were more likely to betray each other and cheat, whereas the people who played the community game were more likely to cooperate with each other. So literally just the name of the game affected a controlled environment, the way that people behave within it. And obviously, like, you know, I'm not the only one that sort of thinks about education within this context and sort of, you know, thinks about of some of these experiments for education is being thought about at the moment. Issues can be thought of as being shaped by frames. So just to in the mood, here's a little cartoon of people being like, yeah, we have to invade because of weapons of mass destruction, and then equating with being American and nationalistic, right? So even if we want students to do all these different things that we do, so become a trustee and like vote, even if we want them to attend Saturdays on a Saturday night, we need to consider how we're framing things, because that's going to likely to affect how students see the world, right? So this frames inquiry was kind of premised on this, and so as I said at the start, what we did, we brought together marketing staff from Leeds, Warwick, Hull, King's, Bristol to analyse the frames that they were using, so that we could better understand how to engage students in some of the stuff that we're trying to do. Okay, I reckon I've kind of blasted through that start section. Are there any immediate questions so far, or am I to crack on? Just type at bar. Great. Okay, so I've said shape behavior, and I haven't really explained how. So one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that you can understand how frames shape behavior is by engaging certain values, right? This study is sort of underpinned by a lot of different studies in social psychology. And broadly speaking, when we talk about values, what we're talking about is these are like your guiding principles in life, and they influence what we do or think, and that they're shaped by lived experience, so they're shaped by frames. Right. So in 1992, Sharman Schwartz did a study of 38 countries and found that 60 values would consistently reoccur across those. Right? And so these are those values. What he did was that he mapped out those into different values types. So there's 10. What you can see is the 10 types of values. So 10 in which you group those values. So universalism basically means a connection with nature and a care for other people, regardless of where they are. Where evidence is more caring with people around you, and then around conformity and tradition, they're kind of self-explanatory. Security, kind of always, power is about wealth, social power, social status, those kind of things. Achieving things, but according to socially constructed what is achievement, right? Like according to social standards. Obviously, kind of know what that is. Stimulation is about variation in life, and then self-direction is about freedom and creativity and those sorts of things. Right? What we understand is that people will have a different kind of composition of values, right? So people's values will cluster. If you look at that middle there, what you can see is the big red spike is an achievement value, and that means that the values around that are likely to as well, and that these things will translate roughly into what people's goals are, what their attitudes are, and what their behaviours are. And obviously we can't always behave how we do. Again, in controlled testing, then values seem to be one of the things that affects those things, right? So in summary, our values can influence and behaviours. And what you don't really need to remember all this stuff, but is one further distinction in terms of different types of values, and that's between extrinsic and intrinsic values, right? Values are the yellow and green ones, so self-direction, universalism, and benevolence. And these values are related to, well, in the literature they're referred to as self-transcendence values, values which are to do with a care for other people and a connection with nature. Whereas extrinsic values, so they're the power values at the bottom, they're related to self-enhancement. They're like wealth, individual status, individual sort of prestige, and those sorts of things, right? And consistently, time and time again in the literature, people with more dominant intrinsic values will have different. Well, that will predict different behaviours and attitudes to the people more extrinsic values, right? So, example of that. So there was a test where they asked people how much risk does climate change pose to society, and people with more egalitarian, so more intrinsic values, would be more likely to say that it's a high risk than those more hierarchical or extrinsic values, more likely to say there's slight or no risk. So in other words, your values will map onto your attitudes around climate change. With some testing around things in union, for example, because we were able to measure values there and also then measure their attitudes, this women that I found. So basically, the more important they said students said benevolence values were, the more important they thought it was that the student union provided raising and volunteering opportunities. So that's an example from student unions. This is one that is very relevant to the election and equality agenda, particularly in student unions. So this was some research that PERC did with where they used the Eurobarometer, which has attitudes towards diversity, basically, and in social survey, which measures people's values. And what they found is that in a survey that asks how comfortable would you be having a political leader from the following groups, and then you've got under 30, over 75, religious, transsexual, etc., that people with more intrinsic values, so stronger self-direction, universalism, and benevolent values that you can see in the middle, they need to have more positive attitudes towards those people, so women, homosexual, etc., in leadership positions than those with, for example, strong achievement values, as you can see on the left-hand side. So more intrinsic values will also predict, in other words, more positive attitudes towards diverse leadership, which obviously is a very key thing for a lot of student unions, right? Now, there's lots of different stuff about how values behave, but one of the key things for us to understand, values can be temporarily engaged by certain environments, right? So here's an example from Mio, who's a psychologist who's working at Cardiff, and it relates to volunteering, which obviously which obviously unions do a lot. So what Mayo did was he and this test students, so I guess it's kind of super. Students are kind of like the lab rats of psychology, basically, which is kind of quite helpful. Okay, he got the participants to memorise items of furniture, either benevolence-related words, so they are intrinsic value-related words, so forgiving, helpful, and honest, and then achievement, so that's an extrinsic value related word, so ambitious, capable, successful, and food, which he uses as a control group. And then he said at the end of the test that he did another experiment, but like this one, he couldn't pay people to take part, and then people to volunteer to take part. And what I found was that people who'd been primed with benevolence values, so even just being asked to remember benevolence-related words, those people would tend to volunteer more time than the achievement people and indeed the control people. So what is that, like, depending on context, can be temporarily engaged, right? In summary then, kind of like these guiding principles, they influence what we do and think. They can be shaped by lived experience. So apparently there's 5 times in life when your values shift most, and going to university is one of them. Retiring is another one. Having children is another one. We all have all these values to a certain extent. Some values will be dominant, right? So people will tend to have certain dominant values. Values are dynamic, so values aren't fixed. Your values aren't fixed over time. They're dynamic and can be changing, and education is one of the times that they change the most. And engagement, certain values can become more dominant. Right? Okay, I reckon I've kind of crammed 60 years of social psychology, sort of. So what type of values do you think are most dominant on campuses? Campuses at the moment. Just again, just write chat bar answers. Anyone? There we go. Back. Equality and well-being. Value. Yeah. Dave. Yeah, I'm a bit sort of, this stuff. You walk around campuses more, you look at what messages people are experiencing. I've become a little bit obsessed with like university advertising, and if you look at what sort of values are being promoted through messages on campus, they tend to be really, really extrinsic. So it's all about achievement. It's all those extrinsic values of self-enhancement. So it's all about how to be the best, or learning from the best and becoming the best, or going to the intellectual capital, or how employability is your top resolution this year, right? And how this is number 1 university for employability. It's all about achievement values. There's little asterisks here, which then says, well, not really, but and then all about being the next big thing, and greeting big business, and you too could one day be, as long as you're a male, a certain class. So it's interesting to see how increasingly on campus the messaging is reinforcing sort of values, basically. So I'd agree with you, Dave, that it tends all about wealth, prestige, status, achievement. If you look at values, I mean, what just again, because otherwise it's just sort of odd. It's me talking at my laptop with some names flashing in front of me. So I need to remember that you're, be reassured that you're there. What values do you go out in like your strap plan? Democracy, yeah, equality. So yeah, democracy again, diverse and inclusive, yeah, represent, yeah. Yes, of the values of the unions that were involved in the project. So they're all those things that people have said. Yeah, sustainability as well, right? So, so if you start to think, well, if you start to map these values on that values map that Schwartz developed, then there's a pretty straightforward pattern. Basically, a lot of student unions' values are all pretty intrinsic, right? So they're all in that top section. So you've got equality, diversity, sustainability, those things that you said. They're all universalism values, right? So they're all about sort of caring for other people, a connection with nature. There tend to be a lot of that benevolence values stuff, so being people orientated. And there's also, because of student unions being independent, there tends to be self-direction value and fun, which then sort of sits on that side of that. And so this pattern that you can see is quite normal So, from that, right, is that student unions values are pretty intrinsic, right? So unions are not values neutral. They have a kind of position, right? So what about students' values? What sort of things do you think students value? So we hear that students have intrinsic values stated in their strategic plans anyway. What sort of students have a type of way? So value for money, yeah, non-investment, basically. Individual, interesting. Yeah. Achievement, fun, yeah. Being employed, friendship, see. Amy said. So, so should I've done Schwartz's methodology and then measured students' values at different institutions. So this is a small and specialist one, and you see is a similar-ish thing where you've got a cluster around intrinsic values, so self-directing, universalism, benevolence. Equality still seems to be the thing that people say is the most important, but certainly Trinity, you had aspired achievement values. So I mean, Amy said specifically, but it alludes also to what Dave saying around Margaret, what you were saying around sort of employees, because there's all that spike around security, which is interesting. So you value security more when you don't have it. So if you move away from home for the first time, for example, you might feel less secure. So you're likely to, in that context, value security more. So, but other than those spikes around achievement and security, you do have, broadly speaking, at that institution, intrinsic values being the most dominant values on campus. I mean, students not really on campus. The South Bank, so same sort of pattern. And then at King's, it was a similar thing. So the takeaway from studies is that they're very different. They're quite different institutions, right? So you've got Russell Group, you've got small and specialist. You can actually students still have intrinsic values, like they're social universe and benevolence. There is a big cluster around that, but there is also this cluster around achievement and security. And basically, I haven't tested this. There's not really any way to test this that I can work out, but I would argue that security, I kind of makes sense point of view of the being away from home for the first time in some instances, and also the kind of, students are more subject to crime. They're about it's about 4% higher than the adult population. But the achievement values, if you're basically having all this debt, then it's not surprising that you then are like, oh God, well, how am I going to pay this off? So achievement becomes more important in order to sort of honour your debt to the creditor, right? So, and look at across Europe, then students are kind of just people, right? This is more or less the same. So you can see again, like Ben's universalism, self-direction values are quite dominant across Europe, and then there's that little spike around security. And if you look at the data again, that increased after 2008, which doesn't be surprising, all things considered. But the reason I'm showing you this is to say that, broadly speaking, students have intrinsic values the same way as you do, whereas a lot of the advertising, a lot of the messages which we're which basically students are being subjected to. We're being subjected to as staff, because we're people too, right? Are extrinsically orientated, which is kind of interesting. The big question, so we've got about half an hour to look at this, is what values do student unions frames engage? And so that was what the frames inquiry was like specifically looking at. So what we did was we from each of those 5 student unions, we asked them to provide 2 bits of text and then a deep frame reading of those 2 bits of text. These examples covered democrating in like voting and stuff, participation, so clubs and societies type stuff, and then help, so welfare or the advice service type of thing. Which they alongside the text. That's pulled out from so these are which can be used like inclusively. So it's like when it's like me and you, or exclusively. So it's like we, the organisation, not you, or universally. So like we, human beings, right? And so we looked at which of those we's student unions were using. Then we looked at what is the text saying is important. So what values are being engaged through it. Onto values dissonance. And then finally we looked at what worldview, so what assumptions or beliefs are subtly being sort of promoted without being explicit in the text. So with that, for each of those 3 things and the 5 student unions, so that's 15 bits of text that we analysed in this way. Okay, I'm just going to take you through some of the sort of what we found out. Okay, of how a student union tried to get people to win an election. So this is the stand, right? But within it is it's all kind of a transaction frame. So a transaction frame doesn't have to be, it's an exchange, but it doesn't have to be an exchange for money. But it does have to be, if you give this, then you get that, right? So what happens in this instance, within this transaction frame, is that the student union is saying, we're offering you this, the community is the students, so in return for standing, they're told that they get pay and employability, experience, and power. So if you look at this, right, it's pretty, they say, right, you get to be a elected officer, what you get in return for that is money, right? You get employability, so you lead a £10 million organisation, that will prepare you for the next step. You get experience, is basically the same thing. Then you get power over stuff, so trustee and dictatorship. At the end, it sort of says, well, winning isn't everything. So that's the first time out of all those 4 examples up to there, the values that are being engaged aren't extrinsic values that aren't about power and achievement. But then actually, if you look at under what it says under winning isn't everything, it says even if you don't win, it will still look good on your CV. So actually, the 5th one is still about power and achievement values. Similarly-ish, here's another example. So in this scenario, this is about getting people to vote, and basically the frame we found here was that there's within unions there's the officers and the actors, right? So the officers are the actors, so they're people that do the stuff that helps the students. But the story that this told was that the students have to help the helpers by the actors by voting for them, right? Broadly speaking, this was pretty common. That despite being actually sort of about exercising collective decision making, more or less all elections were framed just as a competition. So right, so there's winners and losers, and in that you'd have some intrinsic values engaged, because it would be about helping other people, that these people that were elected help other people. But it was also about achievement values, so it was about influence. So you have the power to do who these people are, and it's about them being the sort of all-powerful actors, whereas the students, despite the fact that, if people who worked in the union do they do they should be participating in creating change. The way it's framed unconsciously in the vote material was only really the officers that make the change. So if you look at the literature around democracies, it's interesting to note that basically the in was that political engagement is tied to intrinsic value. So it says these studies suggest that political engagement is directly tied to moral engagement within social structures, and that sustaining a vibrant participatory political culture requires cultivating a principled citizenry, right? And so it's the last bit that's key. It's about how do we cultivate a principled citizenry, not sort of an alienated consumery, right? Here's on participation. So this is actually my favourite one for the reason I'm on to. So what within this is that there's this what refers to as a defender frame. So a defender frame is when there's a danger, right, and someone defends you from that danger. So the danger in this scenario, in this volunteering and fundraising, is that it's saying 725,000 students already volunteer, and therefore they have an advantage in the job market because it says because 73% of employers would hire people who've got volunteering experience. So it's saying, look, there's all these people who are already volunteering. So if you volunteer as well, then you're losing out to these people. And what the student union does is it rushes in and says, don't worry, we can help you to be one of these volunteers. It sort of defends them against that danger. And do this transaction frame. So it's getting something for something. So it says, if you join one of these groups, then you get all this stuff. You get to meet people, you have fun, you develop new skills, you enhance the CV. So it's an interesting mix of values which are being promoted because at the top it will say the way it frames the student union is saying we can help you, so we can help you volunteer. So the way the student union is very intrinsically, whereas it uses a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators to get students to volunteer. So it will say groups large amounts of money charity, but then we'll also say, but you should do this for your CV. So what it does is it mixes those intrinsic and extrinsic values. And if you look at the research around this stuff, Bauer in 2012 experimented with so literally just sat people down in front of pictures of luxury and consumer items and then a control group, and he found that those who were basically framed as consumers, they would have this tendency for low investment social activities, decreased motive for high investment, so a student organisation or volunteering for a good cause. Bear in mind again that this test was done on students, right, and on lower levels of trust in people. So if you're engaging and reinforcing if you're using consumer framing with occasions, then these are the things that potentially you could be in people. Coming on to the help example. So this one is about being to pop. Right? This is about a scenario whereby if you are experiencing any complicating circumstances, then the student union will work you to let the university know that you're not fit to sit, and that this can help you make sure that you don't avoid not performing exams. I guess quite interesting because it frames students very much as charities, but still in an intrinsic way. So the way that the student union talked about itself is in that kind of like we're here to help you sort of way. The way that it treats students is far more extrinsically. So it's saying if you don't do this, then you might not achieve well as highly as you might do. And so well-being isn't seen as necessarily like seen as a precondition of achievement. Right? So you need well-being in order to perform in your exams, and it's the exam performance that's important. So it's extrinsically orientated. And again, if you look at the research then, like extrinsic values are linked to anxiety and depression, smoking and alcohol use. So Tim Kasser, in fact, wrote in his book, which I recommend thoroughly, called Some Problems of Materialism, or The Dangers of Materialism, which looks at how basically people who are more orientated towards achievement values, wealth, are likely to have lower levels of satisfaction and well-being. So what I found, in summary then, is that student unions have largely intrinsic values, so they largely have universalism, benevolence, and self-direction values, just as you seem to say you had. So looking at the data, both institutions, but also looking at data on people's values more broadly, students have largely intrinsic values. However, all student unions frame themselves intrinsically, right? So they'll frame themselves as charities more often than not. Students will use a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic, or just extrinsic frames to motivate students. So in other words, we kind of assume that students are only really motivated by self-interest, which, if you look at their values, doesn't seem to be the case, right? And therefore, by contributing to this extrinsic messaging on campuses, students actually risk inadvertently undermining the behaviours or attitudes which they are trying to foster in our members, because civic participation, high levels of well-being, volunteer participation, all these things are actually underpinned by intrinsic values. So in other words, the dominant your intrinsic values are, the more you are to do these things, the more likely you are to have higher levels of well-being, the more likely you are to vote, the more likely you are to engage in high levels of pro-social behaviour, right? But we try and motivate them to do that is using extrinsic frames, which is quite right. So we'll go back to very long time ago now, to those statements that we looked at the start, right? So this is statement one, and we use it to explain this thing called values clash, and hopefully this will work, right? So do you believe this statement? So teaching children to be polite and have good manners helps them become more independent. Did you believe? Was that on your believable or not believable list? You just yes or no, maybe. Not. I've got one no. Okay, so we've got 4, 5 against. Okay, so right, this is an example of combining two different values within one sentence. And so within this, right, you've got teaching you polite and have good manners. So polite and good manners are tradition values, right? And then saying it'll help them become more independent. So being more independent is a self-direction value. And what the research suggests is that if you combine values in one sentence this way, that will cause this thing called a cognitive dissonance, right? So in other words, people won't. So that sort of broadly works so far. Let's see what happens next. So the next statement was encouraging creativity in people tends to make them more curious. Was that believable or not? Not. Yes. 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 Okay. Well, 5 yeses. Okay. 7. That's 2 yeses and 1. So doesn't have a values clash. So it's both self-direction. So it's that encouraging creativity. So creativity is self-direction value, makes you more curious. So that doesn't include actually should be pretty believable. This one's always pretty tricky. So what happens? So people tend to avoid getting into doubt during times of civil unrest. What do we feel? Believable. The 2 years and main now. Yeah, it doesn't work. It's interesting. So basically, right, this is believable because it's two security-related values, right? So civil unrest is lack of security, and avoidance of indebtedness is a security value. But that one's always a bit weird. Anyway, let's try the next one. Okay, so ambitious people tend to have more close and meaningful friendships. Believe it or not. 2 knots so far. 3 not. I love how some people just use caps. It's ace. Okay, so maybe 7 to 1 knots. This means achievements. So yeah, yeah, it's true. This one should be believable because ambition is an achievement value and meaningful friendship is a benevolence values. So that's right. And people tend to be most at peace with themselves while shopping. 2 knots, 3 knots, no. Okay, yeah, 1, yes. So if you're totally reading the last one wrong, people are saying no. So yeah, so that's right. So being at peace with yourself is universalism, whereas shopping is a wealth, materialism, basically. So that's right. That's a clash. And then finally, people tend to be more broad-minded, walking in areas of natural beauty. Is that believable or not? Yes. Oh, we've got. Okay, universalism values, right? Broadly works, so that's helpful. So yeah, so people, all the psychology again suggests that this is the case. So the experiment, I can't remember if it's on the next slide. Ambulance. People were shown a series of hypothetical people, and then those people who said that had to oppose this, say it's like unbelievable, where people said that they do bad art, unbelievable, is values that people want. I think you can kind of see this statistics, right? So people on the left or the right feel, into ground, then they'll start to cognitive dissonance, right? Whereas people are super, like, I do believe you. Think about what's happening with politics at the moment, with Trump and some. Also cognitive dissonance, that politics don't become believable. But when they're pretty clear in coherent values, and that comes through consistently in what they're saying, then they become more believable whether you really agree with them or not, right? Here's an example of mass values clash in volunteering one. So the act of volunteering is about making a difference in the community and being part of something really rewarding, which is universalism, right? It's about meeting new people and making friends, so that's benevolence. So they're intrinsic, but then it will say, but also all these other students already do it, so you better do it too, right? So conformity. And then saying you've got to do it to enhance your CV, so that's power. And then it's saying 70% of employers would employ people who volunteered over those who haven't. So then it's about getting a job, which is an achievement. So even that one bit of text, it engages so many different values that it's likely to have it's like massive cognitive dissonance when you read it, right? It's not likely to be believable that volunteering does all these things, right? And to say that we've just sort of tested with you, and as in the example on ambivalence, right? So this is what we need to think about when we're communicating, is that we need to think about whether we've got clashing values in this. So yeah, so look at it. It's kind of all over the shop. These are the different values that the runs to volunteer would engage. Who is we? In all 2 of the 15 that we looked at, the we used exclusively. So in other words, it's we, the student union, not the student union. Despite the text, the student are the student union, which is exclusively, so wouldn't you? Okay. Quite often means for things students have set up is subtly different, right? So to add to those observations that we had before around student unions having intrinsic values, students having intrinsic values, student unions frame themselves students unions use intrinsic and extrinsic or extrinsic frames to motivate students. What we think is that by mixing intrinsic and extrinsic values in your communications, students risk evoking that kind of ambivalence, right, or potential confusion in students. And also that the way that we use we in our frames keep students at arm's length from the student union, so it'll be us, the student union, not you, the students, right? So, into what's happening now, one of the things that we with Kings to do was to what an intrinsic pressures we would look like. So we go from having this kind of first class experience to being about discovering what you love and doing and meeting new people. So looking at more intrinsic ways of orientating this stuff, rather than saying, oh look, we've got these award-winning venues where you can get competitive around a pool table. He says these fantastic social spaces and that you can, look at the amazing river, rather than sort of like orientating club societies around opportunities to develop skills and broaden your CV. It's about having a family that you choose away from home, trying new things, making a difference. Engagement with the local city, rather than being the city of personal opportunity, it's the city of creativity and ideas. So they're intrinsic frames. Rather like volunteering in this sort of way that clashes different values. Talk about some of the most amazing stuff that King's students do, the health and law, work in schools and helping less privileged people into medical school, running homework clubs with kids. Actually really amazing stuff. So let's not leave it off. And so, the going is that actually student unions aren't values neutral. They have a very clear set of values. They have a very clear worldview around equality. We want students to behave in certain ways. We want to be better citizens. We want them to participate. We want them to be well. And we need a frame that more effectively fits that kind of worldview, right? And talking to them like that. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff sort of crammed into sort of 50. So we've got 2 minutes if anyone has any questions.